It happened so fast that half the courtroom didn't realize what they'd witnessed until the echo of the slap had already died, until gas ricocheted off the marble walls and the gallery erupted in confusion. Officer Blake Ransford, a decorated, feared, and internally loathed cop with too many SEAL complaints to count, had just raised his hand in open court and struck the face of a composed, older black woman standing beside the bench, not knowing, not caring, that she was no ordinary observer, no court-appointed liaison, and certainly not someone without power. Her nameplate had been discreetly removed during renovations, her robe left behind for the day's ceremonial review. But what Blake didn't see, what he couldn't comprehend beneath the weight of his own ego and the trigger of his barely contained rage, was that it just laid hands on Judge Marsha Ellison, retired appellate judge, federal monitor, and newly appointed inspector of judicial and law enforcement misconduct for the Northern District of Illinois. She had been there quietly observing, compiling patterns, reviewing transcripts of police overreach, and connecting dots between crooked officers' cover-ups and a citywide corruption syndicate tied directly to Blake's precinct. She hadn't spoken until now, hadn't drawn attention, but when she stood and calmly told the court, "This officer has perjured himself for the third time today," Blake had turned, red-faced and trembling, storming over with the arrogant entitlement of someone who'd never been told no by a system designed to protect him. And then, in front of cameras, in front of colleagues, interns, and a jury of stunned citizens, he slapped her across the face like a schoolyard bully caught off guard. And in that exact moment, for minutes before the system that protected him began to burn, Marsha didn't flinch. Her head turned with a force, but her feet never moved, and when she looked back at him, eyes calm and full of fire, the entire room stilled as if time itself held its breath. Blake's voice, snarling and defiant, filled the room. "No outsider's going to come into my courtroom and disrespect my testimony. This is Chicago." And yet, as the judge who had been presiding stood in stunned silence as the cameras clicked, as courtroom officers hesitated with fear and confusion, Marsha Ellison reached into the inner pocket of her navy suit, withdrew a leather-bound folder, and placed it firmly on the judge's desk with the words, "I'm here under direct order from the Department of Justice. You've just committed felony assault on a federal officer, Officer Ransford." And that's when the gas turned to chaos, when Blake's smirk wavered the first time, and when the young woman from the DOJ, seated silently in the back, previously mistaken for a court clerk, stood and raised her phone, revealing a live video feed being broadcast to Washington and already archived as evidence. Marsha's voice never rose, but her authority shook. The room, "I was sent here to investigate a pattern of systemic abuse. You just made my job a lot easier." Outside the courthouse, a black Suburban had already pulled up, escorted by federal marshals, ready to detain Blake under federal custody, while the Chicago Tribune's fastest reporters raced to rework their headline from "Routine hearing ends in heated exchange" to "Chicago officer slaps federal judge in courtroom meltdown." What none of them knew, what no one understood, was that this slap would trigger subpoenas, leaked body cam footage, confidential informants, and the unraveling of a silent empire that had ruled Chicago's inner system with an iron fist and unchecked power for over 13 years. Because in precisely 4 minutes from that slap, the first sealed file in Marsha's folder would be opened, and everything Officer Blake Ransford thought he could get away with would start to fall like dominoes. The moment the marshal stepped into the courtroom and took Officer Blake Ransford by the arms, the silence cracked like ice under pressure, and Judge Marsha Ellison, still composed, despite the sting blooming across her cheek, slid the sealed folder toward the presiding judge with the steady poise of someone who had waited years for this precise moment. Inside that folder, bound in red string and stamped with an official DOJ seal, was not just one man's record of abuse, but the blueprint of a corrupt system stretching through precinct halls, city contracts, falsified testimonies, and buried IA reports that named names, times, and locations with precision that made silence no longer a shield for the guilty. The presiding judge, trembling now as she read the first few lines, recognized at least 3 names from her own career. Cops she protected, dismissals she'd sign off on, times she'd told herself the evidence wasn't strong enough, and suddenly the gravity of what had just happened, of who Marsha Ellison really was, began to pull the room into its orbit. Meanwhile, Blake, thrashing with bravado, shouted, "This is political. You can't do this to me. I run this city, as his wrists were locked in steel by the very system he thought he controlled, and behind him, the doors opened to reveal 3 more federal agents entering with a box of warrants and a portable hard drive. "You don't run anything anymore," Marcia said quietly, stepping back to let the machine she'd ignited do its work. Each warrant correlated to a different officer, precinct, and city contractor. Contract awarded without bids. Security footage altered or lost. Witness. Intimidation swept under paperwork, and the mysterious overtime bonuses that pointed to a laundering ring no one had dared trace back to its root until now. In the gallery, a young black law student who'd been clerking for the judge sat frozen, realization dawning on her that this moment was history being made in real time. And across from her, a journalist in the Chicago Ledger whispered into her phone, "We're going to need the front page cleared. This is going national." As Blake was pulled past Marcia, his eyes met hers, and for the first time there was no threat, only disbelief, because in all his years of bending the rules, bending people, he'd never been outmaneuvered by a woman who didn't flinch, didn't scream, didn't push. She simply gathered the truth and let the weight of it do the crushing. And yet, what Blake didn't realize, what no one realized, was that this was only phase 1. The folder was not the end, but the beginning, and upstairs in a federal holding van, 4. Encrypted laptops waited to be plugged into DOJ servers, each containing audio files, phone logs, and GPS data that would tie nearly 24 officers, 2 city judges, and 1 former deputy mayor to the single thread that Marcia Ellison had pulled quietly, relentlessly, and without fame until now. And so, as the courtroom emptied and news helicopters hovered over downtown, and the city began whispering about the slap that brought the storm, Marcia turned to the gallery, her voice low but firm. "Everyone who's ever said they won't believe you. Today, we made them listen." By the time Officer Blake Ransford was booked to the Federal Holding Center on West Jackson Boulevard, the ripples of his courtroom assault had become a wave crashing against the very institutions that once protected him. News anchors scrambled to piece together the timeline. Former victims of police misconduct began stepping forward with trembling voices and grainy footage. And inside the Chicago Police Department's 3rd District, a sudden vacuum of fear spread as officers began wiping phones, deleting message threads, and calling in favors they'd promised would never need to be cashed. Meanwhile, Judge Marcia Ellison stood in a small DOJ command room surrounded by analysts and federal attorneys, her fingers trailing the digital touchscreens mapping a network of corruption with names blinking red. Precinct captains, civic board members, 1 judge already under sealed investigation, and a prominent city developer whose private security firm had provided illegal surveillance for years. All of them tied to Officer Ransford, not by blood or loyalty, but by the quiet code of unchecked power that had ruled Chicago's undercurrent like a machine fed by fear. At City Hall, Mayor Alondra Pierce was handed a folder at 3:02 p.m. by her chief legal advisor. One look at the header, DOJ Oversight Directive, immediate compliance required. And she knew the fallout wouldn't just be political. It would be structural, systemic, something that would rewrite her entire city's foundation. Back in the courtroom, Marcia's presence had sparked something more than headlines. Community members who had watched sons, daughters, and brothers be silenced for years began gathering outside the courthouse, holding signs not of anger, but of vindication. And as cameras zoomed in, 1 cardboard sign stood out. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the truth. Inside a conference room at the Tribune, a veteran journalist opened a sealed envelope anonymously delivered that morning. It contained a recording from inside a patrol car dated June 17th, the same night a teenage boy was shot and declared armed and fleeing. But the audio revealed a different truth. "He's just walking, man. Turn off your cam." Within minutes, the newsroom went live with an expose titled "The Cover-Up Culture, a City's Secret War," and soon after, Senator Diaz of Illinois issued a formal statement calling for independent oversight of all police-involved incidents in Chicago going back 10 years. Blake, now alone in his holding cell, watched the storm he had set off with a single open palm begin to sweep through the city like a fire in dry grass. And in his chest, for the first time, bloomed something unfamiliar. Regret not for what he did, but for finally having to face it. And yet, Marcia Ellison wasn't finished, because in room 7C, the secure DOJ evidence vault was opening, and inside it, labeled only as Operation Glasshouse, was the final piece, A sworn statement from a former internal affairs investigator who vanished 3 years ago, detailing a ghost unit operating off books, bearing misconduct, and ensuring officers like Blake stayed untouchable. But now the spotlight was here, the silence had ended, and every secret they buried had just been given a name, a file, and a very loud voice. IT was 7:11 a.m. when the raids began. Quiet. At first, with unmarked vans pulling up to addresses in Bridgeport, South Shore, and the edges of Oak Park, agents in plain clothes stepping out with sealed indictments and a calm urgency that only comes from knowing justice had been delayed but not denied, and across the city, doors once locked by power were being opened by the weight of consequence. 3 sergeants were arrested before breakfast, a 4th judge was suspended pending review, and 1 city treasurer was escorted out of his condo. In silk pajamas, as neighbors filmed in hushed disbelief. Inside the central evidence room of the 4th Precinct, files long thought lost in flooding were discovered neatly boxed and time-stamped. Proof of planted weapons, coerced statements, and systematic erasure body cam footage, all of it cataloged and sent directly to Marsha Ellison's war room, where a digital screen now displayed a glowing map of collapsing alliances. But while most of Chicago watched in awe or panic, inside the mayor's office, a storm was brewing of a different kind. Mayor Alondra Pierce, herself once a defense attorney who fought against this very corruption, now stood at a podium surrounded by city seals and federal officials, and with the world watching, declared, effective immediately, we are establishing a civilian-led independent oversight board with full subpoena power, investigative autonomy, and the backing of the United States Department of Justice. This city will never again allow fear to masquerade as law. The press erupted, half in applause, half in stunned silence, but it was nothing compared to what came next, because as cameras flashed, Judge Marsha Ellison stepped forward, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with a quiet grace that held the weight of centuries behind it, and spoke only 10 words. This is not revenge. This is the beginning of repair. Her words were played on loop across every major network, but inside, holding cell 118B, Officer Blake Ransford sat on the edge of his cot, hands trembling not from cold, but from realization, because his name was no longer feared, it was documented, no longer whispered about, but broadcast, and as his fellow officers began to resign, confess, or flee, the empire he had helped build on intimidation and silence turned to dust beneath the pressure of exposure. Meanwhile, in classrooms across Chicago, teachers played the press conference and told students, this is what justice looks like when we refuse to stay quiet. And in barbershops and buses, in courthouses and coffee shops, the conversation had changed, not about whether abuse existed, but how deep it ran and who had the courage to stop it. And yet, even as arrests mounted and headlines shouted, Marsha moved without arrogance, meeting quietly with families of victims, reviewing cases previously dismissed, and preparing the final release, a report to Congress outlining a model for other cities. A blueprint forged not in politics, but in truth, proof. That one woman, one moment, one open palm met with steel composure, could turn an entire city's corruption into ashes and plant something better in its place. In the weeks that followed, Chicago looked different, not just on paper or in policy, but in its pulse, in the way people walked into police stations without shrinking, in the way officers now paused before raising their voice. In the sudden presence of community advocates, seated in precinct meeting rooms once sealed tight from public eyes. And though the marble floors of the courthouse were scrubbed clean of the chaos that began it all, no amount of polish could erase the echo of the moment a badge struck a judge, and the gavel of history struck back harder. Officer Blake Ransford's trial began with no fanfare and no courtroom theatrics, only a thick silence broken by the reading of 31 charges ranging from obstruction to civil rights violations, each tied to real people, mothers whose sons never made a home, store clerks, whose testimonies were rewritten, and teenagers who carried trauma like pocket change no one believed they owned. And across from him, seated beside federal attorneys, was Judge Marsha Ellison, not as a victim, not even as a witness, but as the architect of accountability, a woman whose quiet fury had dismantled machine built on fear and rebuilt it with the one thing no one expected, truth. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom did not erupt. It exhaled a collective release of air held for too many years, and in the hallway outside, a young girl clutched her father's hand and whispered, "That's the lady who changed everything." Marsha heard it but didn't turn. Her work wasn't done, because the headlines had moved on, but the wounds hadn't, and in neighborhoods still shadowed by decades of mistrust, she walked without cameras, without robes, sitting with families, rewriting dismissed cases, funding youth legal workshops in her own name, and insisting her name never be used as a shield, only as a bridge. And yet, her presence lingered like a lighthouse in the city's soul, a reminder that justice didn't wear capes or shout into microphones. It walked in quietly, listened, waited, and when the time came, struck not with rage, but with the full weight of the Constitution behind it. In a mural painted on 55th and State Street, her image now stood next to Thurgood Marshall and Ida B. Wells, beneath a quote in gold that read, "Truth is louder than power when you let it speak." And Officer Ransford? Her story will be taught in law schools, whispered in courtrooms, and told to children as proof that a system isn't broken if someone still remembers how to use it right. As the empire of corruption fell apart, the city of Chicago stood a little taller. Not because it was healed, but because someone had finally dared to clean the wound instead of covering it. And in that cleansing, a new kind of justice was born, one that didn't ask for applause, but only remembered.